So just a introduction, Guy Bartram, Director of Product Marketing at VMware for our cloud providers. Thank you today for joining. So what happens to data in hyperscale public cloud? We need to kind of consider, first of all, where the data is in terms of the localization of the data and the locality of the data. That's obviously, as we have seen and heard, subject to, when you're looking at hyperscale, a global network, particularly for the US hyperscalers like Google, AWS, and Azure. And that data can be moved across different data centers and different regions within those hyperscale environments. In some cases, in some hyperscalers, without any notice to the customer. So what happens to data when it's processed in hyperscale cloud, public cloud, is really up to the hyperscaler. It's very difficult to pinpoint where that data is. And this is one of the kind of data location issues. And hyperscaler, I think there's a number of things you need to look at: the location of the data, the controls in place to manage that. Very important is the classification of that data. Is it sensitive data, or is it data that doesn't really matter if it's in public domain? The recovery process of that data, and that's particularly important because you might be recovering in the event of a failure into a data center outside of the region. There's, again, very difficult to control that. And most importantly, the jurisdictional control of the data. All US companies, US cloud providers are subject to the US clarifying lawful overseas use of data, which is the Cloud Act. And that really governs cross-border data access for the US. So any service provider that is subject to jurisdiction can, with an appropriate legal process, be compelled to disclose data that is in that provider's possession, so customer data, regardless of where that data is located. So I think really the question becomes, hyperscale definitely has its place. The question really then comes about, are there adequate safeguards in place for you to monitor and manage that data?
Guy, you raised some really good points. I think we did some research recently, and we found out that it's almost 90% of European data in some way is touching hyperscaler networks. So it's a massive amount of data in the EU that is already, if you like, in the hyperscalers domain, and could be subject to the Cloud Act, which is something that we've seen challenged in EMEA a few times. And it's the whole point of what we're discussing today is the rise of the sovereign clouds as to understanding exactly where your data can and can't be. One of the things we found working with our partners, Veeam, is, we major on data management, and obviously with backup, and with backup comes disaster recovery. And what we've seen from our end users that are going to the hyperscalers is, when they want to recover their data, when there's been a disaster, it's great in the first instance, you can design everything to be in different availability zones. So in the event of a disaster, it's all going to recover somewhere else. But quite often the hyperscaler cannot guarantee that recovery will take place within the same borders as where the data originally existed. And for some organizations, that is an absolute no-no. That cannot happen. So we've seen, not just off the back of that, but for other reasons as well, some repatriation of data from the hyperscaler clouds to more local clouds within country where data sovereignty can be guaranteed. And some of that, as I say, has been driven around DR requirements. Some of that has been driven by cost, which is something we'll discuss in a few minutes. But it's also, it's also been driven by the fact that when the workloads originally moved to the hyperscalers, they were always planned to move back either onto the customer's premise or onto a local provider. You talk about data classification and understanding what the workload is, and therefore what is the best place for that workload to run. And some workloads were never meant to stay in the cloud. It was DevOps, and production moves back on premise.
Yeah, and I think there's I mean, you said at the beginning, 90% of the data is in the domain of a US service provider, whether it's on EU soil or on US soil. The other kind of thing to look at is there are challenges around things like FISA 702, around targeted surveillance of foreign persons outside the United States. And this covers kind of all of the intelligence information that the US may want to get their hands on. And in Europe we have GDPR and a few other things. I think what we've got to say or got to look at is, our legislation changes, European legislation changes. In the United Kingdom, our legislation changes a lot as well. And we've got to look at those appropriate safeguards, which provide that legislative restriction on data to keep it safe and keep it in region. But I also think there's a kind of national interest to look at here. I've been speaking to a number of providers in the UK who provide sovereign cloud, and one of the interesting things their CEO said to me was, they have a lot of really good innovation coming from the UK in terms of machine learning, AI, and that next generation application development. The trouble is that these applications require data, massive volumes of data to process, to become more tuned to the application's needs. So without that data, and with 90% of that data residing potentially outside of the nation, it's actually not doing our national interest any good, because all we're doing is feeding the national interest of potentially a provider in a different jurisdiction. And we're not furthering our national kind of capabilities and national interests in that respect. So I think from a UK perspective, in terms of social values, when we look at the kind of ESG classic governance, environment, and social aspects of sovereign cloud, these are really important factors to consider as well in terms of national interest.
Yeah,
but I think in a way we should sort of bring the conversation back a little bit and just think about what does our data look like? What are the services that we need to run to support our businesses? So I always look back at, we really should be looking at, the different workloads, the different data sets that we have, make sure that we run a proper kind of data classification process on that data to determine what do we need to do around this data, because there's some data that, we probably don't mind, being exposed. It doesn't have, that level of privacy requirement in it. So perhaps, that data is okay in the hyperscaler. We don't care who gets to see that data ultimately. From privacy or regulation point of view, of course, most data has some sort of intellectual property tied to it for a business. So, we want to protect and safeguard that. But I think like cloud is like any other IT platform. You have to judge it on its merits and its values and what is it bringing to you. So with the hyperscalers, we do have to be aware that potentially we are contravening privacy regulations, and not just in Europe with GDPR. There's a lot of privacy regulations now appearing all over the globe. There's the big one in Asia. I think even California has a much more stringent privacy policy, versus the rest of the US. So I think we just have to be aware of what it means. And, if we do have private data, we shouldn't be, shouldn't be using the hyperscalers for that. So that there is an element of having to do that work up front to identify, what's appropriate to go on what platform. But, I would argue that that's best practice, in any sort of IT organization anyway. I think the other thing is we will look at what's the attraction of putting data into hyperscalers, and there's some very good reasons for that. But I think the big one is the perceived cost saving, and I think that is there's some smoke and mirrors going on there. I think is everybody is finding out now, with the additional charges that can suddenly be racked up on, especially when you bring data back out again. But there's huge benefits. The flexibility and some of the new technology that has been driven by the likes of Amazon and Google and Microsoft, who obviously are the big three players that we're really sort of referring to. So yeah, my point is, I think just it's all about using the right platform for the right data sets or workloads.
Yeah, Neil, you address a good point. And in the VMware Sovereign Cloud Initiative, we address data interoperability as one of the kind of key pillars and requirements behind sovereign cloud. And that would basically mean the ability to move your workloads in and out of a cloud environment without having major significant changes to those workloads. And as we look at the sovereign cloud initiative evolving, and hopefully standards around sovereign cloud evolving as well, like someone's mentioned on chat, Schrems 2, there is always the challenge with legislative jurisdiction and where that company falls under in terms of legislative jurisdiction, if I could say that properly. And that's always going to be a challenge. From all the reading I've done online and everyone looking at the applicability of sovereign clouds in hyperscale, it is always undermined by the fact that hyperscale falls under a US jurisdiction and hence is subject to US laws, and that presents not only the Cloud Act, but there's other kind of aspects there which are very worrying in terms of the transfer of private data and data collected in hyperscale environments in and out of the regions with very little control over it.
Oh, you're right, Schrems. So originally there was the I'll try and get the name right, the data protection shield that existed between the EU and the US around the protection of data, and that sort of came off the back of GDPR, if you like. But that got challenged by the Schrems Act, which was like I think it was came around 2020, which challenged that data privacy shield. And what it means for people now is whenever they're doing a data transfer outside of an EU country, and it's interesting, given Brexit, Guy, whether that's going to cover the UK as well, but in my sort of EMEA, any data transfer that goes outside of an EU country, there has to be a risk assessment done on that data transfer to make sure the data is going to be compliant. So it's an additional, as you say, it's an additional level of work on top of everything we've done with GDPR to then say, okay, now when I do a data transfer, I've got to do an individual risk assessment, even if it's going to a US company that we previously thought was covered by the EU-US data privacy shield. So it's an extra level of work. And I think to some of the things that you said, Neil, about people understanding their data more and what are the rules that they've got to adhere to. Certainly in the larger enterprise organizations, there's probably a whole team of people trained on this, that it's their daily job. But I think as you move more, down into the medium-sized companies, into smaller companies, I don't know if the education is there. It's a big job to keep on top of.
All the time, all the expertise, I think, with smaller organizations who are probably more likely to feel the lure and the pull of the hyperscaler because they offer fantastic services at good price. So why not outsource your whole IT department, to the cloud? I mean, it absolutely. I can see the pull. I think the challenge is, or maybe you've got to. I mean, GDPR absolutely states that the regulations are there to try and help organizations and individuals, protect privacy. And they can talk a lot about data protection by design. When you're building out your infrastructure to be compliant with GDPR, that's one of the key tenets is data protection by design. So I think when we look at the Schrems 2 law case, which essentially I think it was to do with some information on Facebook that they were trying to exercise the right to be forgotten and have that information removed from Facebook, and Facebook, whatever. But I've tried to come off Facebook before, and I tell you, it's very, very hard to get your data removed. But it was he challenged, he wanted it done, and I think essentially GDPR agreed that actually anything in the US would not be, the data shield was just destroyed, wasn't it? And I think there was a lot to do with the introduction of the Cloud Act in the US. So I think the question really, or the point raised is quite interesting, because there is country level privacy laws, there's regional level privacy laws. Where is this going? So I guess if you're not sure, I would just say architect everything, so you've got data protection in mind for everything. So rather than have to categorize everything, you almost have to think, right, we don't know what's in here, so therefore we should just make sure that everything is protected well, and we should be using sovereign cloud, for this kind of data, because then we don't have the risk of contravening any regulations or actually losing any private data. So I think by design, it should be, well, let's just do the most secure way of protecting our data from the beginning and apply that across the board. So that's the easiest way to probably deal with it.
I think from a customer data is obviously like names, addresses, and that sort of information. Is a lot of that is covered by GDPR within the EU. Now you step outside the EU, then suddenly, as Neil was saying, right, you're subject to wherever the jurisdiction is that data is residing in, and that's kind of the challenge. Accounting data as well is, and I would argue, kind of metadata, and those are potentially governed by their own kind of privacy aspects as well. So there's different levels of data to consider when you're looking at where you're going to be running your infrastructure or your cloud or your applications. You've got to understand what each level of data is, what it's composed of. The individual requirements of those different levels have got to be mapped out, and a lot of that you're going to get by default in a sovereign cloud provider within your nation. And that means, when I'm talking about sovereign cloud provider, I'm not talking about a hyperscaler. I think the hyperscalers are saying they have a lot of sovereign cloud solutions, a lot of the ground to cloud stuff, and that may seem applicable, but at the end of the day, and as we've seen in Schrems 2, it's another arm, another service of a company that is under US jurisdiction. And some part of that data at some point needs to go back to the main control plane for that hyperscaler cloud. So it may be, accounting data, for example, or usage information data. That's got to be transmitted back to base to be processed and for a bill to be created. And that's that level of technicality in terms of the business support systems that are running these massive hyperscale environments. They're typically not going to be located in the EU, or certainly not going to be located in the region that you're functioning in, the country you're in the EU. They're going to be processed most likely back in the US. So again, I think it's that data classification, that understanding what your data is, and then applying different rules of control, metering, authorization, and identification of that data. So you can use the right cloud for the job. And this is certainly we're not saying that don't use hyperscalers. Hyperscalers have their place for sure. Yeah. But when you're dealing with different types of data, you need to be more conscious of what it is.
If you look at what the hyperscalers have done around that, is they've created numerous partnerships, with local providers in country to try and separate out that data, to say, okay, well, you know, certainly the account data is never going to go outside the country. It's always going to be dealt with by the local partner, you know, and we've seen partnerships in Germany, Italy, and various other countries with the hyperscalers. And that has helped the hyperscalers to move into those countries. Sometimes they had to build in their own data centers there. You know, they built the data center in partnership with the local provider to get around those things. And they have to a certain extent. There's a certain amount they can do. As Guy said, there's still that central management control plane. There's still the data could touch the network and go back for billing purposes. And at that point, you've then negated, you know, it being a true sovereign cloud in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about data residency at that point, right? You're not talking about data sovereignty. Residency is kind of where the data is, subject to those regional privacy laws. But sovereignty is, you know, subject to regional privacy laws as well, but is also a matter of national jurisdiction and national obligations and rights over that data. So, for example, if you deal with a sovereign cloud provider in the UK, they're going to have a third-party legal entity that is in the UK and not a legal entity that is outside of the UK. And that's a really important point, because that provides you the jurisdictional control of that data and that data residency.
Yeah,
you know, I think as well, if you look at some of the cloud, the local cloud providers in Europe are doing, they've obviously seen GDPR and the impact. And in fact, I think I was made aware of GDPR before it was actually introduced by a very forward-thinking service provider in Jersey, who was already dealing with let's say sensitive data. But I think what we're seeing is a lot of the providers are building different levels of secure platforms to be able to offer to you, depending on what the nature of your data is. And I think especially in the UK, one of the partners that I think all of us here work with, they kind of have 3 or 4 different platforms, ranging from almost sort of general public access to top secret, confidential, must not even be on any sort of network at all, where you actually have to physically take your data in, and it is so well protected that it's very difficult to get access to. So there's that whole range, and I think the hyperscalers are beginning to recognize that they need to do that as well. But ultimately, they are challenged by the fact that they are an American company. Therefore, they are regulated or managed by the US government, who have this mandate that they must share data, and there's no getting away from that fact. So therefore, that if you are putting personal private data around an EU citizen in the hyperscalers platforms, then potentially you are in breach of GDPR. And I say potentially, I guess you are in breach of GDPR. There's no getting around it. I'm trying to not speak in absolutes here, but I guess sometimes you have to. So I think that's the biggest concern. That's what it always goes back to. So you either don't put data that's private in the hyperscaler, or you use sovereign cloud is what I would argue.
I think you mentioned this earlier. We're talking a lot about the sovereign cloud providers and the hyperscalers, and I think one thing to stress is the hyperscalers are not all bad. We're highlighting the issues you have around data, and that's a very important issue that we all have to adhere to because of GDPR. But it doesn't mean that the hyperscaler platforms are a bad thing. And I think, as you mentioned earlier, Guy, one of the key considerations here is understanding the data classification, therefore where you can put certain types of data, but then also understanding that as that data goes through its life cycle, it's mobile. That if you do start on a hyperscale cloud, that you can move your data somewhere else if you need to in a usable format. And when you do move that data again, that's when GDPR and the trends and all these other things come into effect. Are you moving it in a compliant way? Where are you moving it to, and why are you moving it? So, although we talked a lot about the sovereign clouds and the clear advantages that they have, and I think I'm feeling I get you guys' views on it as well. It's a bigger discussion day by day, the sovereign cloud discussion. I think people have educated themselves on the hyperscaler cloud. They've used it for what it's really good at. I talked earlier about the repatriation that we've seen. Some of that is not just driven by data privacy rules. That's driven by cost as well, but also functionality. And I think, something that we don't talk about a lot, but is actually the local touch and the local support. When people are using the public cloud, they're getting a very vanilla solution. When they do look at the data classifications and the other needs that they have for that data or that application or service, then they start to build a bespoke SLA. And building that bespoke SLA in a public cloud can be difficult. You need the right partners to help you achieve that, but can be easier to achieve on a sovereign cloud or with a local provider who are more used to delivering bespoke SLAs per customer. So, we talk about the hyperscalers, it sounds like we've said they're bad. I don't think we're saying that. I think we're saying you really need to understand your use case, your data privacy levels, the level of SLA that you require, the recoverability, and also the mobility of the data. So there's a whole range of things that people need to consider.
I think you raise a good point. And I think there used to be a functionality gap between, what you could get in a US hyperscaler environment, like AI and machine learning applications, those third generation ICT environments, and not be able to get from your local cloud provider. And certainly what we've seen recently, particularly in VMware for our VMware cloud providers, is bringing in things like machine learning, bringing in vGPU services, and actually innovating a whole lot more than you can in a hyperscaler. And that's been, I think, an interesting journey now, because the argument of I need to go to a hyperscaler because I need to use the application that, quite frankly, I'm never going to be able to afford is going away. And I think what we're seeing is this hybrid evolution of the right cloud for the workload, where you might want to have a totally segregated environment. You might want to have an environment that addresses a particular vertical, which is subject to a lot of legislation and control. And you might want to have another environment where you're providing access to, a sales application. It needs to be mobile. It needs to have global load balancing. And that's where the presence of the hyperscalers with their global reach can really complement a solution you're doing without risking your data and exposing data.
I think that again comes back to education of people understanding how to architect these things across multiple cloud platforms. And it's something, as a data management company, we see all the time is, if you are designing across multiple cloud platforms, how do you make sure the data is mobile and usable across those different platforms so that you don't become locked in? Because as you say, there's certain aspects of the hyperscalers that are, the content delivery networks they can deliver, that you're not going to get anywhere else. I mean, let's be honest, it's difficult to get them anywhere else.
Yeah. And I think the support aspect of it, Graham, is really important. You talk to a hyperscaler about your regional legal jurisdiction and control, and I doubt, I'm just taking a random guess here, but I'm doubting they'll have a deep knowledge of your country's legislation around data and data classification and data controls. They might have, general GDPR. Everyone pretty much understands GDPR globally, but GDPR isn't enough. That's like a big shield going across the EU. And then there's all the individual shields within the countries in the EU, and it gets much more complicated.
I've actually seen 2 cases in the last 4 or 5 months where we've been working with one of our local service providers on a backup solution for a SaaS application, and we've been against somebody who's delivering this as a SaaS solution, the backup as a SaaS solution through one of the hyperscalers, and we've won a couple of these. And GDPR was discussed, but it was more around, can you guarantee the data will never leave my borders? And that couldn't be guaranteed. But more importantly, can you provide me local language support within country? And this was moving more into Eastern Europe in particular. It became a requirement. You know, we want local language support. We want to be able to call somebody locally. So it sort of talks to the sovereign cloud story that we've been discussing today. You know, people are starting to care about that again. And, you know, our local service provider won the business. You know, I think, you know, as a company, I'd be interested in your comments on this, Guy. You know, we all have a public cloud business unit. You know, we do an awful lot of business with AWS and Azure, an increasing amount with Google now. You know, that business is growing rapidly. But I don't think what we can ignore is our service provider business as well. It's also growing rapidly. And, you know, I come to negotiate my targets every year with my boss. And I keep saying, oh, the growth is going to slow down. And he doesn't believe me when I say the growth is going to slow down, because it isn't. It is, you know, it's still growing every year.
I think you raised a really good point there, Graham. You know, data, as we all know, is exponentially growing and will continue to exponentially grow. You know, we're on the steep side of the hockey stick, where the volume of data now needs really in-depth management and understanding. Something that, you know, we really haven't really in the past, I think, focused on in detail. And this is obviously, you know, working with Neil and Cloudian and yourself and Veeam, you know, looking at Cloudian's object storage solutions and bringing those into our cloud providers. We're now able to manage different types of data with all of the access controls that we need and integrity that we need. And obviously the security and compliance as well within our cloud providers, but provide that as an integrated solution. So I think, you know, just like, you know, you need policy controls for workloads within a cloud. So, you know, you spin up a new workload or a new application, it's protected by dynamic firewalling, which just picks up that it's there. You know, the old days of having to submit change request forms and get a piece of hardware in the data center were kind of much easier in some respect to keep control on. And we're in this world now where data is just actually exploding everywhere. And I think it's a real challenge for companies to understand what that data is, how does it expose them. GDPR has done a lot of really good work in forcing companies to look at that, because the penalties for not looking at it are so severe. But now we have to look at the sovereignty and control and local, what's the one before, the residency of that data, where it resides. So there's a lot more to consider, which, you know, your local service provider is skilled to help you with within your national jurisdiction.
We touched on it earlier again. Cost is a massive element of that, you know, because you talk about how easy it is to spin up new workloads. And yes, you know, they can start to get characteristics that are associated with that type of workload assigned to them automatically. But there's a cost associated with that. And I think, again, I don't want to make the hyperscalers sound bad. They make it really easy for you to scale, which is fantastic, particularly for a DevOps project. You know, if you're trying to get something moving, a new application, a new service, it's a great way to do it. But you've got to have one eye on the cost. Now, because of the great service that they offer and the self-service capabilities they give, it's easy to keep adding workloads, and you can put a budget on it. It's a wrong analogy, and I apologize in advance for it, but it's like a betting application. You can put a limit on what you're going to spend. Yeah. And in some ways, you need to do that with the hyperscalers, because it can run away with you. Now, when you're dealing with a local service provider, that tends to be more process interaction. You want to create how many new workloads? Yes, we can do that. This is going to be the cost. Yeah. And it's almost like the cost is presented up front rather than at the end of the month in a bill. And so you're aware of it, you see it at the end of the process. And I think it's interesting, you know, I've spoken to some of the larger resellers across EMEA who work closely with the hyperscalers. And they're making making a lot of money, particularly on services migrating people to the cloud. But their next big area of revenue is the consistent cost optimization, which is absolutely needed. Absolutely needed. It's a great service that they're offering. And I think it really helps people understand the level of data they have in the cloud and what it does cost them.
I think in that cost conversation, though, you've got to have the interoperability, which is a key pillar to sovereign cloud, which is, let's say the application I was designing suddenly takes a different turn and requires some level of important classified data, or data classified at a different level, to be used in it. Now, this application was in hyperscaler. I've either got to do some very complicated architecture and somehow keep the data there, and maybe tokenize it and exchange it hyperscale, and that's just very, very complicated. Or I can bring that application back into a sovereign cloud within my national jurisdiction. But to move an application or to move a workload between totally different hypervisor technologies, totally different security technologies, totally different networking is a really tough thing. So, that interoperability is something, VMware runs in AWS and Google and Azure in the VMware supported environments, but that gives you the nice interoperability. So I can actually pull that workload back to my local cloud provider with no changes to the workload. Some minor ones, obviously, around networking and stuff like that. But fundamentally, I'm not doing complex disk conversions or anything that's going to threaten the stability of that application.
It's a key point. It's one we've been very aware of. We have technology that allows us to take virtually any workload, and fortunately for VMware, and recover it onto a VMware platform. So it's and we've always our initial view of that. This is about backup and recovery and disaster recovery, but increasingly we've seen it being used as a migration tool. So it's not necessarily just a backup and a recovery. This is a migration tool. When people do want to move from one cloud platform to another, how are they going to do it? And is the data reusable once they get there? And we've particularly seen that with a few software vendors. I'm not going to name them, but you start using a SaaS application, and you say, okay, that was very nice, but my company is now bigger, and I need another application. I want to migrate the data. And then that becomes a massive issue. So it's not just, it's not moving from one cloud platform to another. We've actually seen this problem moving from one application to another. Can I take my data with me? And, people don't always consider that when they're buying a new. But when you get to a point where you do need to move to another application, can you take your data with you in a useful form?
And I think the size of how data's grown, how actually data storage technology has changed over the last I've been doing it for 20-25 years. You've probably done a little bit longer, Graham, I think. Just a little bit. But networking technology hasn't kept up. What's the cutting edge right now? It's 100 gigabit per second. Ethernet really is the cutting edge. Most people are using 10 gig. We had a client that approached us and said they wanted to stand up an exabyte storage platform on day one. My immediate question to them was, where are you going to get an exabyte of data from on day one? Because it'll probably take you, I think my calculations were 2.5 years to move an exabyte of data over a 10 gig network. So my argument was, why don't you buy a smaller cluster to start with, and sort of grow as you bring the data in, because it's going to take you so long to do that. So we are in the exabyte world, or certainly Cloudian now. We are talking to multiple customers that have an exabyte of data that they want in a single namespace, which is staggering. And so we get very blasé about this. We start to throw around words like, even petabyte is a lot, but exabyte, we're an exabyte scale platform. It's a huge amount of data. And manage that amount of data is extremely difficult. There was a question asked on the chat about interplanetary internet, Dr. Kabul from India. Do you know what? I was thinking about this not that long ago, I think last week. looking at Google Maps. I've been looking at buying a new house, looking at areas, looking at the satellite view, doing street view, all of that kind of stuff. And I'm just thinking, this is in Google. This is all of this is accessible by the US government. This is all satellite imagery. How many more satellites do we have out watching us, what we're doing right now, and talk about privacy invasion? And we don't know. We don't know what's going on up in the sky. How do you deal with managing that data? And I would argue the only way to do it is if whoever's capturing that data is then storing it in a sovereign cloud in the country or the region, or that's applicable for that data you've got on that individual. And how do you know that data that person you're monitoring is from EU or US? Or so that this is a whole other kind of worm. So thanks for bringing that up. But that is on another level of I guess we don't even know what's going on there most of the time.
I think we have to sort out our own jurisdictions between our own nations before we can start thinking about the sky above us and the planets that are interconnected, that maybe one day we will colonize.
Collected already, right? And that data is being collected, is going somewhere. Who's got access to that data? And I would argue that a lot of that data is, it's private data, privacy data.
So what about let's switch gears a little bit. What about the data is the new oil and monetizing data and stuff like the GaiaX framework, for example, the initiative from the EU to create a new economy, a EU economy based around monetizing data in a secure fashion?
Do you think that's about monetizing the data, or do you think that's about making sure we have the skills and capability within EMEA or within the EU to compete with the hyperscalers?
It's about both, I believe.
Yeah, it's a little bit back, because one of the great benefits of the hyperscalers is the ability to process those large amounts of data. We talk about machine learning and AI, and I think some of the next sort of scaled down service providers, it's taken them a while to catch up with that. I look at GaiaX and it's a framework of how things are built, how they're managed, and about data mobility as well, to not give that, to make sure people aren't locked in. And I definitely think it has, some way to go. I think it needs the right people to drive it. But I think a lot of it, we've all talked with Mr. Hansford about, the fact that countries need to have their own capability to deliver this at scale.
Yeah,
it's something that's pre-required. If you're going to have a booming economy, this is one of the skills that you need. Almost like generating your own power, or having your own water.
It's a utility, isn't it?
It is a utility,
yeah.
And I think at the country level, or the regional level, cloud, network, data transfer, it's a utility now. It's a tap that we need to turn on and off. But unlike something like water, we need to be careful about what we do with it. We can't have leaky pipes, to continue with that analogy. I'm not sure how far I can run with this one, but it is a utility. And I think there was the huge uproar in the UK about China building and owning the nuclear power plant. Chinese having not just the Chinese, right, but another sovereign nation having control over such an important aspect of our infrastructure. And I would argue that we should be taking back control, and this should be every country. I mean, I do believe that we should, believe in globalization, but I believe in, you got the local region, that where you are, and I think you can't have complete globalization. You start to talk about managed economies and all of that sort of thing, but there is an element you can't manage from too far away. And I think, especially with the pandemic coming in, we've seen such supply chain issues right across the world, with certain regions controlling So, Asia, certainly for the computer manufacturers, for the chip manufacturers, for the silicon, we don't have any of that capability really in the EU. So we are, beholden to these other, huge organizations or slash, state entities. So I think, it is important to start to take back control a little bit and start to encourage innovation in the local area rather than rely on the hyperscalers. Certainly at Cloudian, that's what we try to do, is to look at, I would argue both, VMware and Veeam exactly the same, but, we're looking at some of the new technology trends that have been pioneered in cloud, and we're trying to bring them down to enable, organizations to deploy them, in their local premise, or we can enable sovereign clouds to deliver, the hyperscaler type experience, but on a more local basis. And that's really why, we exist, actually, is to sort of to give that technology to as many people as possible.
So this ties into data sovereignty and sovereign clouds, but those are not new topics. Why has this become more trendy in the last few years, and especially towards this year and towards further in this year, being an even more hot topic to discuss and to think about?
I think as people have started to use, more and more, become more and more reliant, and as Neil said, on supply chain that has capabilities that, potentially a lot of them could be bought in-house and should be bought in-house. But the cost impact of reliance on these other infrastructures has been a big, perhaps unrecognized impact for a lot of enterprise customers and small to medium customers as well. You're getting your cost for convenience balance, which is, just like buying a car. You buy it on lease, it's going to be more expensive. And that's something that I think, it's predictable. And predictability is one thing that's needed, but also I think support and that relationship with such a key part of your supply chain is 100% necessary. You don't have a single throat to choke when you're dealing with a hyperscaler. And I think that the global geopolitical situation has highlighted, especially after the pandemic, the reliance we have on supply chain and the impact when supply chain is, impacted by something else. And we as businesses need to protect our application estate, which fundamentally supports our business. And that means that we should bring as much as we possibly can out of the potential pitfalls of foreign jurisdictional control of my data or supply chain issues of my data, and bring it into a national focus. And I think this is where things like GaiaX are certainly, it's not the solution. It's the right direction in that we're trying to control, and whilst controlling, offer data in a way that it can be utilized and used by other companies, and not inhibiting innovation, actually, contributing majorly to it.
Yeah, that's a key thing. When you look at GaiaX, it's a great initiative. It's the right idea. And, a few very innovative EMEA-based service providers were driving that. The GaiaX membership, if you like, is expanded. And if that's going to work, that's really going to work across EMEA and become, a standard that can be used within country. It needs to be driven by government as well. It needs the support of government to be able to go and do that. The problem you then have is, involving a government entity in something that needs to be innovative tends to slow it down. There's no other way to say it.
That's harsh, isn't it? That's harsh.
Yeah. The two don't go well together.
Yeah. But so it really needs a sort of change in mentality from European governments to be able to drive that innovation at pace, and to be able to drive that framework such that it becomes usable. But I think it's interesting, to look at another trend of why sovereign cloud is important now. And thank Neil for pointing out how old I am. We've seen over the years that there's a sort of waves in IT of centralization and decentralization. It's happened for years. And this the adoption of hyperscalers was another decentralization, and that decentralization, and if you like, I wouldn't say ignoring of the sort of legalities of it, has driven massive innovation. And with that, people have done things quicker. We deliver applications and services much quicker than we ever have. But then comes the reality: I've got to deal with the data, and I've got to deal with the data in a secure way. So we get that contraction again. We get that centralization again. And I think this sort of wave of centralization is the sovereign cloud. What do we see after that? Maybe the GaiaX framework means that sovereign clouds between different countries in EMEA means we can expand it again, and we get another wave of decentralization. So it's a constant thing in IT that we've seen over the years. I don't think it's going to stop.
But I really think that why this is going to go back to Daniel's question. Why is it being talked about now? I honestly think it's there's two key points that have really brought this up as a conversation, and one is obviously the prevalence of ransomware attack at the moment.
Yeah,
it's such a huge. It's really making everybody think about data protection and data security. It's got to be. It doesn't matter how big or small an organization or an individual you are. Your potential. You could be potentially attacked at any time. I mean, it's as simple as that. And I also think, going back to the pandemic and the supply chain, I think that has really focused a lot of governments on. We really need to look at this. We need to have a regional strategy around how to do this. And GaiaX is it's a really interesting conversation of a bunch of different MSPs and entities and governments even, trying to build something that I think is well intentioned. But I saw recently in the news that there's one European MSP has already pulled out because some of the hyperscalers are trying to muscle in. And then, if they're in there, and then who's got the money to drive that conversation? They do. Does that then not become completely worthless? So you've got to always wonder about something like this, unless it becomes a law or a gold standard. How do you really get a gold standard approved across countries, across organizations? I think it's always something like that is always very, very difficult, but I think it's very well intentioned.
Yeah, I think it's in the right hands, really, of the EU to drive something like this. If you're looking at trying to get nations to pull together is kind of like herding cats, right? And they're all going to go off in their own different directions. And I think what they're doing is, as an initiative, is a very successful initiative to start and to run and to nurture. The challenge about whether we should involve hyperscalers in that initiative, personally, I think they need to be a part of the initiative, because we can't ignore the fact that they deliver a hell of a lot of value to all customers of all sizes. But the challenge is how much they influence the initiative in their hyperscale capability and way, and take away from what we're really trying to get down to here, which is protecting our national assets. So big one of those is data. And ensuring that we have the right supply chain to deal with things like a pandemic, where the NHS needs so much more electronic compute capability, and it needs it very quickly. We as a country need to be kind of ramped up to be able to deal with that and respond to that without being necessarily the beck and call of another country.
The other thing about GaiaX and the hyperscalers, and really the balance that has to be made, is it is about standards of security, standards of how you build your infrastructure, and that data mobility is key across that. Everybody wants a certain amount of lock-in. Let's be honest about this. With the hyperscalers, everybody wants a certain amount of lock-in because they want you to stay on their cloud. If it's totally open and you have the ability to migrate workloads at will between different cloud platforms, and I know, Guy, you're going to say that with VMware on top of those platforms, it enables you to do that.
It's still locking.
But that's still locking from another point of view. Yeah. So there's always going to be that sort of balance between having a little bit of lock-in and having the openness that gives people the freedom to move their data wherever they want to. Because that's how people make their money. Let's be honest about that in the cloud world. So there's always going to be that balance.
Sorry, Graham. We have 3 minutes left before the end of our session today. Any last thoughts, items you want to share with everyone viewing us today on the session?
I think from my perspective, I'd say that VMware Sovereign Cloud Initiative is an initiative to drive pretty much exactly what we've been talking about for the whole session. It's looking at the provide that data sovereignty, that jurisdictional control, and having that local legal entity to deal with the jurisdictional controls is really important. You only get that with a sovereign cloud provider, and we're pretty stringent about who we allow into the initiative, and they have to pass a whole load of checks within these 5 pillars. But as an end customer, consider your data as this is fundamental to running your business. So consider access to your data, like Graham was saying, and integrity of that data. DR, if you're in a hyperscaler, can you recover into the same region? Is there a threat that you're going to be in breach of your jurisdictional control if you have personal data in another region, for example? And focus on security, compliance, understanding the data levels, the mobility we've touched on briefly, that ability to move in and out of a cloud. And as Graham said, Veeam does a lot of that migration between those clouds. And lastly, obviously looking at the innovation and analytics that a lot of our sovereign clouders are nurturing with programs like GaiaX, which they're pretty much centrally involved with. But also innovating with the companies they work with, like VMware, Veeam, and Cloudian.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to say, I think everyone should remember that they are responsible for their own data. You can't rely on any platform, to manage and govern your data how you need it to be. So I think it's just the awareness. A lot of people think that they put the data in the cloud and it's nice and safe and secure. And I think, Graham, you'll back me up on this one. Is Office 365, for example. There's one copy of data there. You lose that, you're gone. So back it up. Back it up and protect it. Just because it's in the cloud doesn't mean it's being backed up and protected. It's just as vulnerable as if it's sitting on a single laptop hard drive. Ultimately, I know there's an element of protection, but there's only one copy. So I would just say, just be aware of that. It's your responsibility. So put that into practice from day one.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The data is the most important aspect of this. We've got our famous 3-2-1 rule about how you should be backing up your data, and then we've added another 1 and a 0 to that. The other 1 is making that backup immutable. We talked about ransomware earlier. It's a massive threat now. You should have a copy of your data that cannot be, subject to a cyber attack. And the 0 is, think about the recovery of your data, where that recovery is going to come to. Can you recover it with 0 errors? And so, this, whether it's from one hyperscaler to another or from one ISV to another, it's thinking about, data to that degree. Can I get it back? Can I move it? Will there be 0 errors? Can I do that in a safe way? And I think there's still a lot of education that we all need to provide to make sure people take those steps. It's becoming increasingly important.
Okay, that's the roundup.
Okay, thank you all for your time today. And again, thank you all for joining us in this live panel session. I've noted down that please, if you have any questions, reach out to us all, and we were happy to continue the conversation on a one-to-one level with you and your organization moving forward. And again, thank you all for your time today. Guy, Neil, and Graham, thank you for joining us today and sharing your feedback and opinions. And to all, have a good day.
Thanks,
guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.